I think a good place to start is to let you know that I've been working on international governance for several years, but I'm quite new to existential risks. I've been in the existential risk area for about 18 months. When I worked in international governance, it was mainly on issues around the governance of biotechnologies. So occasionally I will slip into examples as we go through that will link more to biological risks than other areas of risk. That's just because that's what I tend to know about. The reason I've chosen to present on this topic is that over the past 18 months, I've heard quite a lot of interest from people in the existential and global catastrophic risk areas in international governance, whether that's of existential risks in general or specifically to something like AI. But I wasn't sure whether those were coming from an informed point of view in terms of what we can actually do with international governance. So the structure of this presentation is to look at what international governance is and what its key components are in terms of risk management. And in particular, why it's appropriate in this particular case and what it might achieve that other levels of governance can't. So why bother with international governance? Then there's the but. But there are various challenges and weaknesses around international governance, and there's a need to be careful and to consider what you're actually asking for if you say, I want an international treaty on artificial intelligence. So I'm going to discuss some of those, but also the sort of more general problems of whether international law is, in its current form, in its traditional forms, actually still relevant today. But given all those challenges, I still think it's worth having some international governance of existential risks, and so I'm going to give an idea of where we might start with that. So I don't think I need to define existential risks in this room, but I want to pick up on these points which I think are important if we're considering what we want international governance to achieve. What aspects of existential and global catastrophic risks, which I'll probably shorten to extreme risks in some of these slides just so it's easier, but what sort of aspects do we need them to consider? And I think it's important that we consider in the design that the risks could be of natural origin, but they could also emerge from or in combination with human activity and technology. So it's quite a wide range of sources that we need to deal with. And that while some may be associated with a single event, they're more likely to result from events coming in combination and have cumulative and cascading effects, and link into the levels of interdependence and connectedness in our societies, and the capacity of human systems to cope at times of severe social disruption. So we need to be dealing with the social, political and economic side of things, as well as looking at technological and the actual risks themselves and the events that could occur. So, what is it that international governance can do and achieve that other levels of governance can't? So this is quite a broad statement about, in general, when do we want international governance? International governance is where we want coordination of state behaviour in areas of high international interdependence where separate action by individual states is insufficient to address issues of common concern or achieve common interests. And there are many of these. Climate change is a very easy example to give, disease control, but also most existential risks are going to fall into this category too. So more specifically, what can it do? So in the context of having a highly interdependent international system, but also the context in which it has massive and persistent inequalities within and between states, people, technologies, materials, knowledge are highly mobile and transfer easily across boundaries. Independent action is likely to be insufficient for control. If you, in one country, decides to stringently control a particular action or technology, it can simply move elsewhere. So that gives us this greater need for coordination. The quote on the slide is, again, it's from a book on biotechnology governance, but it is more generally applicable. So international regulation is going to have greater potential than that at other levels to contribute to more even distribution of benefits and establish measures to ameliorate negative impacts, because these things are transboundary. It can play a role in introducing accountability and responsibility for management in transnational risks, help to balance the varying needs of interests of different countries, and promote transfer of technology, financial assistance, information and skills for capacity building. You know, I keep saying it can. That's important, it can do this. It doesn't necessarily succeed that often. So a bit more on what international governance actually is, if we break it down a bit. So international governance is formed of rules, norms, institutions, and other mechanisms that are designed to influence state behaviour in the absence of supranational government. Despite the fact we have the UN, this doesn't mean there is a governance above a national government. And so we exist in what's generally thought of as a state of anarchy. International governance mechanisms are the way we try and coordinate behaviour in that situation. So what are some of the key components? Rules, one of the first ones. In terms of international law, the scholars will divide these into two types. There's hard international law, which are treaties and conventions that have been negotiated and agreed between states, and they are legally binding on those states that have subscribed to them. So they've got to have adopted and ratified them, and then they're legally binding. There's not necessarily strong enforcement measures, this varies between treaties, but there's a legal force to these. And the second is soft law, so in contrast these are voluntary standards, guidelines and codes. Now these do influence state behaviour as well, and hard and soft law is a difficult distinction. Actually soft law instruments can have greater influence at times, and they can have advantages over hard law instruments in terms of their adaptability to technological changes. So a second area is norms. One set of sort of norms in international law come from what's known as customary international law. So this is based on long-standing state practice. So in these cases, there may be an international rule. Not all states need to have signed up for it to be seen as having force and applying to everyone. So the prime example of that are the Geneva Conventions. Things like not using torture and inhuman and degrading treatment are now seen as applying to all states regardless of whether they've signed up to the Geneva Conventions or not. The other form of norms are found in the preamble to various treaties and in declarations. So you often have something that's called a declaration on, say, the human genome and human rights. What's in that does not prescribe particular actions, but what it can do is guide behaviour. It can also kind of give you a guidance as to if you're looking to how you might govern a particularly new area of technology, you can look to some of those principles and think how they might shape it. So next is prohibition. Some international treaties simply prohibit certain technologies. They generally do this not through kind of wholesale prohibition, but a prohibition, for example, that comes from the Biological and Chemical Weapons Convention, is a prohibition on their use in warfare. They also prohibit research and development, but it's the use, it's the intention behind what you're doing that's prohibited rather than a particular technology. So again, these prohibitions mostly can have normative force and quite strong normative force. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they can be enforced in other ways. But even that normative force is quite important. I would also say one of the values actually of having this thing about the intent and having it quite general is that, again, that can cover technological and scientific advances. If you were to have, when writing the Biological Weapons Convention back in 1972, have specified exactly which areas of science and technology it applied to, with 40 plus years of advances now, it would miss capturing a lot of those advances. However, because it has this general thing about the purpose and the intent behind what you're doing, it's really, and states have confirmed this, it applies to anything within biology. So next is international organisations. International organisations are created by states. States retain decision-making power within them. They tend to form their governing bodies, although day-to-day operations will be undertaken by a secretariat. So it's important to know that they retain authority within them, and they are their main funders. So a lot of the time we find that an international organisation will get blamed in what happens in a crisis. So the World Health Organization got criticised a lot for what happened with the Ebola outbreak. But you have to remember that the organisation consists of its member states, and it's up to the member states what happens and what that international organisation does. And we have coordination mechanisms between international organisations. So if an issue crosses more than one international organisation and their mandates, you can find mechanisms for coordinating between them. So an example there is the One Health Initiative, finds coordination between the World Health Organization, the World Animal Health Organization, and the Food and Agriculture Organization. Okay, there's lots of key components, so there's more on this slide. So some of the international rules actually contain specific procedures for risk analysis and management and communication. Standardised methods that you get through having these, so they will help with harmonisation between countries, but that also helps you to make informed decisions. So if you know what standards another country is applying, you can make an informed decision about, for example, whether you will import an animal product from that country. There are reporting mechanisms and requirements. So those can support implementation of particular rules, facilitate timely responses, and they can trigger risk management. So if you know a disease outbreak is coming, you trigger certain procedures in order to try and manage that. There are surveillance and monitoring systems. So they perform a similar function in early warning and triggering of risk management. So those can be quite general again. So again, in the biological area, you've got the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network of the World Health Organization that will pick up on any human disease outbreak. But you've also got more specific ones. So there's also a Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. So that will only pick up on the human pandemic influenza viruses, or potentially pandemic influenza viruses. You have expert networks. Now those often provide support to surveillance and monitoring systems. They can give advice when a particular crisis event occurs. And they also do things like diagnostic development and diagnostics, vaccines, treatments. So they often will be a form of laboratory network, for example. There are science advisory processes. Again, it's a similar thing. There's experts giving advice to international organisations on scientific and technological developments that are either going to increase the risks they're concerned with or that could help them manage those risks. So again, for thinking of something like the Biological Weapons Convention, yes, they want to know about something like CRISPR that might make it easier for certain groups to misuse the technology, but they're also interested when you have a new diagnostic that will help with surveilling disease outbreaks. And there is capacity building. Capacity building could be directly targeting risk management capabilities, so you may have training procedures for risk management, but it can also be more generally, so something like building scientific and technological capabilities, building healthcare systems, building administrative systems, and also the basic thing of increasing participation in the international organisations by developing countries can come under capacity building. And so while those aren't directly risk management, they will contribute to it. Okay, now on to the but. So there are various flaws and challenges, deficiencies in international governance, and I'm going to run through several of those. What you may have noticed so far is that I've talked a lot about states. That's because states are the main actors in international governance. It's clues in the name, it's international, it's between states. They're dominant actors in international governance. They create and are the subjects of international law. They form the membership of international organisations and retain decision-making authority within them. And they're responsible for implementing international policy at the national level as well. States are going to continue to be important actors in international governance, but they are not the only important actors. There are others. There's others who are already important, so non-governmental organisations, multinational corporations, even some individuals. I think these actors are likely to have greater significance than states in driving future technological change. Some of those actors are. And at the moment, there's no clear way of dealing with that with traditional forms of governance. So I think we came across some discussion of terrorist groups yesterday. So individuals who have advanced capabilities are very hard to reach because they're distributed and disseminated. So even the national level is going to have difficulty governing, say, DIY biolaboratories. Trying to do that from the international level is even more difficult. The other actors who are going to be difficult to reach through state-centric forms of governance are, for example, technology companies that are very wealthy, who don't need to worry about being sanctioned by international law because they're not the subjects of international law, and can move themselves around between states quite easily. So I think traditional forms of governance are going to maintain some importance going forwards, but there needs to be a shift to more innovative forms of governance as well. More. Even when you have a substantial range of governance mechanisms in place, this doesn't mean you have an operationally effective system. So in the area of biological risks and biotechnology, there's about 37 international rules, about 15 international organisations, and a variety of other governance mechanisms in place. I wouldn't say they're doing it effectively. They're good in some areas, weak in others. And again, there's a whole sort of range of individual problems that can pop up when you've got that many rules dealing with a particular issue. Rules will not always be implemented by all states in the same way. There's often quite a lot of flexibility as to how you implement something at the national level, and not necessarily to the same extent either. Rules may be in tension or conflict with each other. They're often developed in separate areas without much awareness of what's going on between them. So rules in the area of environment and rules in the area of trade may clash with each other. And there are significant disparities in the capacity to participate in international policy and the ability to effectively implement it. So to get to more specific challenges within this, states are nominally equal under international law, but obviously this isn't the case in practice. So powerful states continue to dominate international processes. They would dominate what gets onto the agenda in the first place. They can dominate what actually gets into the law, but also, again, what gets implemented. So we have a great number of commitments to capacity building in international treaties that aren't fulfilled. We have short-termism and pursuit of economic competitiveness. So again, states generally pursue short-term interests, often linked to electoral cycles. So if something's going to happen in the next 5 years, that might be of interest, but beyond that, it's a little more hard to motivate them. Pursuit of economic competitiveness is a key driver for states when they're in negotiations. There's aversion to pursuit of a narrowly conceived version of national interest in times of crisis. So to explain that a bit more, what the state will tend to do in that case is look to the immediate needs of its own population and neglect what would be an effective global response to a crisis. That in turn then leaves us all more vulnerable, so actually if they'd have really considered their national interests, they may have acted differently. So in, for example, the 2009 influenza pandemic, it was only about 4 or 5 developed countries had advanced contracts with vaccine manufacturers. So they got the vaccines. Other states were left without them. Those states that got them weren't the most vulnerable, they were not the most affected. And that's not actually the way to have an effective global response to an outbreak. You'd want to target the vaccines at the worst affected groups, you'd try and contain it. So luckily that wasn't a severe pandemic. By those actions, though, they could have prolonged the pandemic, they could have made it last longer and be more severe, and that would have had, in turn, more impact on their populations. But that does seem to continue to be the case, that's how states respond when a crisis hits. Again, there are large disparities going on, so disparities in vulnerability to risk, capacity to manage risk, capacity to access the benefits of scientific and technological advances. And this is becoming a barrier to gaining international cooperation. There's usually a bargain within international treaties that goes something like, we'll agree to have control over a certain technology, but in return you agree to help us develop our own scientific and technological capacities. So again, to use an example, the Biological Weapons Convention prohibits using biological agents equipment for non-peaceful purposes, but it promotes their use for peaceful purposes. And there is an article that says there's going to be international cooperation, technology transfer, financial assistance in these peaceful uses, particularly in the health area. But if those commitments are inadequately fulfilled, the next time you try and have control over a technology, and this seems to be happening now, developing countries will turn around and say, well, you didn't do it last time, why should we believe you, why should we enter this bargain with you? to place any controls on our technology. Again, this is largely to do with economic concerns. It can be seen as a hidden way to try and harm economic development of some countries. Complexity. So, this is best illustrated with this slide. You've got an increasing number of issues that are being dealt with at the international level, and they're not always well coordinated. You don't need to know the detail of this slide, but the basic thing is this is a state asking itself whether it can export a genetically engineered bacterium. I know about 13 international rules that they would need to be aware of and consider. A lot of states won't be aware of all of those rules. So this kind of threatens or it just undermines coordination of state behaviour. So you don't know which rules you should apply. Other states don't know which rules you are going to apply, and it all gets a bit confused. So more challenges. Poor coordination. Okay, again, that speaks to that last slide. You've got all these different things going on. You could have mechanisms to coordinate that better, but they're generally not there. I spoke about the mechanisms you have for coordinating between international organisations, but a lot of times that is blocked. It's either blocked for political reasons or it's just blocked because they simply don't have the resources to do that work. There's also something called what I refer to as the burden of regulatory proliferation. So again, you've got more and more regulation going on at the international level. That requires corresponding activity at the national level to implement it. It requires you to participate in more and more international negotiations. And this poses a significant burden to many states, and in turn weakens their participation in international systems. Inadequate resourcing. So the international organisations that already exist are usually severely resource constrained. So they struggle to take on what they're already handed, and adding more to their agenda is just going to cause more difficulties. Again, this also speaks to the capacity building element. So those international organisations are often committed to trying to ensure representativeness in negotiations, so to support developing states to have bigger representations at those negotiations, but again, they can lack the resources to do that. Rules can be designed badly. Some of that can be, again, down to the lack of coordination, so you fail to be aware of another rule and put something in place that's in opposition to it. It can also be about transferring inappropriate principles from one area of governance to another. So an example there is that principles from the Convention on Biodiversity about states having sovereign rights over their biological resources have been transferred into the management of influenza viruses internationally. I say that's inappropriate because we're not generally concerned with conserving the biodiversity of influenza viruses. In fact, state practice is to try and eradicate things like smallpox and rinderpest. But yes, those sort of things cause problems. And key components absent, I think it's quite clear. Sometimes there simply isn't the rule there isn't the risk analysis procedure, there isn't a management component. And finally, an inability to keep pace with scientific and technological developments. So there are science advisory and review processes. These are often inadequate. They can be politically dominated. They can be captured by interest groups, or again, they can simply not be there. So, I guess the question you might be asking is it still worth it? Well, I'm slightly biased because I like international governance, it's what I work on. But yes, it still does have value, and it has value in an area like existential risk because those are global challenges. If you're not coordinating something at the international level, you're not going to get very far in that management. But if we do go down this route, what form might it take now? Well, firstly, say, like as I mentioned, if we're talking about biological risks, there's actually quite a lot of governance out there already. For other areas and sources of existential risk, there's some, so climate change, there's some. For artificial intelligence, there's very little. And there's nothing at the moment that's trying to deal with existential risks as a whole. We may question whether we want it to do that, but if that was a purpose, there's nothing for that at the moment. So, This first slide is about what I suggest you avoid at this stage. So if you want to have some new forms of international governance, either for specific sorts of risks like artificial intelligence or for extreme risks in general, I would avoid going for a treaty. They take a long time to negotiate. The bargaining processes involved can mean that what you intended it to look like when you started out is far from what it is at the end. There's a high degree of uncertainty in these issues, and that makes agreement on substantive measures very difficult. And having a treaty in place that's quite vague and doesn't really tell you or direct states in particular ways is not particularly helpful. And there's this problem caused by overlap with existing treaties. So I've already told you there's these sort of coordination problems, there's a lot of complexity. You put another treaty in place that might conflict or try to override what's going on in existing treaties, that's going to cause more problems. I would also say avoid having an international organisation at the moment. Again, you've got an overlap with existing organisations. They may not be very happy if you try and take something out of their jurisdiction. That may seem to conflict with me saying they're poorly resourced and can't do everything they've been mandated to do. But also, if they lose an issue from their jurisdiction, they may lose resourcing, so they may not be very happy about that. If you were to choose an existing international organisation and have it house existential risk governance, you have problems that, again, this may not be popular. There are a range of organisations that might take on that role, and they might have competition between them as to which gets it, and certain organisations are viewed differently by different countries, and so you may find that certain countries then don't want to join what you're doing because you've chosen the wrong organisation. As I mentioned, they're generally poorly resourced, so unless you've got the resources for the organisation, that's not the way to go. So what do I suggest? That you start with an international advisory board or consultative group. So the distinction between those two is that, as I mentioned before, international, kind of by definition in this context, means between states. And I'm not convinced that you want to limit such a body to just being something that's between states, again, about the perhaps decreasing relevance of traditional forms of governance. So that's why a consultative group is another form of this sort of a very similar body, but that could be done independently of states or could involve states and other sort of groups. So some of the things that could do, listed here. I think an important thing is, I don't think it should just aim to avoid the challenges that I just mentioned, but I think if you design something like this carefully, it can actively address some of those challenges. So the sort of range of things it could do, it could provide expert advice on request. So a state approaches it, say, I want to know how to deal with this risk, what should I do? It can provide advice, but it could also self-initiate provision of advice. So you don't need a state to come and ask you a question, you want to give advice. You can conduct general review or assessment of risks and policy options, produce reports, reviews, assessments, standards and guidance, undertake monitoring and surveillance activities, facilitate information exchange and reporting, so as I said, serve as a clearinghouse mechanism. That's a term used for some of the information exchange systems that international organisations have. Support capacity building through awareness raising, education and training, develop and help to disseminate norms, convene expert networks. You could then envisage that it might later shift into more of a coordination role, negotiation role, or benefit distribution role. So I should say all of these things are things that are already done by certain international bodies. So they're not kind of anything radical from that point of view. And so but that also means there are models you could look at and say, what worked there, why did it work, what might we want to take or not take from these other models. And that brings me to this, which is, okay, so if you are going to have this and you want to design it, what should you start thinking about? How you want to structure it, how you want to constitute it, and how you would resource such a body. I think there's an interesting dilemma there. Like I say, international organisations that are funded by states are severely resource constrained. States are unlikely to want to commit adequate resources to yet another international body. That implies you want to get some private sources of funding. So perhaps, again, if you're thinking of something like artificial intelligence, you'd want some of the companies to provide funding and resourcing, but the moment you do that, it looks like it's being captured by particular interests. So there are kind of advantages and disadvantages, and I think that would have to be considered quite carefully. Who should form the membership? What other forms of participation might be available? So again, I don't think it would be sensible for this to just be states. If it's not just states, who does get to be involved as a member? The sort of mention of observership, so that's a common thing at the moment, that states, they're the members of international organisations, but other groups can go along to negotiations as observers. So NGOs can do that, and industry groups can do that. How to ensure representativeness. So again, this is about who gets to be involved. Again, particularly if one of the things you want to say is that we want to involve some of the technology industries in this, well, that's good, but they're mainly concentrated in certain states, so you're leaving a lot of voices out again, so that's going to be a key thing if you want something that's going to have a kind of authority and credibility internationally. You want representativeness. Addressing the challenges that were outlined earlier, thinking of its mandate and its scope. So I think I've hinted at this. Do you want to deal with extreme risks in general, or do you want to separate risks by their different sources? What are the advantages and disadvantages of doing that? Its status and the degree of separation from existing structures. So by status I mean, is this going to be a body of the United Nations? Is it going to be something independent? How does it get looked at? And again, I mentioned some of the disadvantages of being part of existing structures. The fact you might get competition and overlap. On the other hand, if you're entirely separate from them, you don't serve the same sort of, or have the potential to serve the same sort of coordination and advice and roles you might do if you were networked in. So that's the end. Thank you. I think yes, sorry. Yes.
You mentioned, I think, for biotechnology risks, there are like 37 different sets of rules. I'd be interested to hear more about who promulgated those rules. Is it mostly the UN, and are they all now owned by different institutions? Who is monitoring those rules? Are they all 37 different bodies, or how do they cluster?
So there's about 15 international organisations that are involved, and so they're clustered. So, for example, the way I've categorised them in the past is in 7 sort of clusters: arms control. I'll see if I can count to 7 now. Health and disease control, environment, trade, human rights, development, and there must have been one other, drugs control. That was it. But there are many ways you could split those up. So one thing would be to say that if you went and looked and sort of said, they don't have biotechnology in the title, a lot of these, you have to sort of think through things like, okay, what sort of impacts does biotechnology have in what areas, and then go and look for applicable rules in those areas. So I mentioned that process because if you're going to do that for another technology, that's kind of how you start going, is there anything here? Well, what impacts could it have? And how do I then find out about those, or what applications it could have?
Are they mostly promulgated by the UN? Or?
Yes, most of those are from UN bodies, so I'm trying to think. So, again, it varies. So the Biological Weapons Convention is a UN treaty. It doesn't have an international organisation, for example. Then you've got things like the World Health Organisation, World Animal Health Organisation, Food and Agriculture Organisation. There are bodies that have been set up for decades and they can have various rules and things. Some of them are applicable and some of them aren't. And then you have bodies that might be treaties created specifically for some of these risks. So there are more specific ones, like there's a protocol to the Convention on Biodiversity specifically on genetically modified organisms. So there are some that are more specific.
Being UN, do they talk to each other?
Yeah, not as much as they maybe should. So again, that can come down to, they usually have a mandate to cooperate. It's usually in their constitution. But they may not have the resources to do it, and there can be these kind of political barriers. So, for example, the World Trade Organization is yet to allow the Convention on Biodiversity Secretariat to even be an observer within its meetings. it's again, it's a political thing that some states don't want environmental considerations coming into the trade arena. Yes, so the answer is that they could do, they are generally given a mandate to, but it tends to get blocked if it's politically unpopular, or it's again down to kind of constraints to do with resourcing. There are some more positive examples. So there is, for example, there's been cooperation between the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization to try and understand how the claiming of patent rights over things like influenza viruses might impact overall public health. So there is some interesting stuff. I don't know which order people have come in, but...
So something that we brought to my attention that I'd like to see what your point of view on. A lot of thinking about the existential risk come from a very consequentialist approach to thinking about future generations, etc. But in the UN, the human security framework seems to be being developed and become very integral in a lot of thinking about how to handle progress. And that is basically a very deontological framework. And we heard some people say there might be a problem here, trying to get the UN and similar organizations to even talk about existential risk runs into compatibility issues. I don't know whether this is a serious issue or something you can just fix by writing one or two papers kind of explaining how we're supposed to mesh. Do you have some views?
So I think one interesting thing might be that actually, again, because there's variation between different organisations, that you can probably find some more of the principles that you would like to use for future generations, particularly in sustainable development. So sustainable development has been quite a big thing. So that is there. Again, it's one of the things, unfortunately, that the stuff we really need to do for existential risk, a lot of it is kind of written in principles and commitments already, but they're the ones we tend to be bad at doing. So there's been a lot of stuff, since the 1970s, on how we should move towards sustainable development that we've not got very far with. But if we had gone further with that, then that would probably be good for the management and governance of existential risks. And I think a way to sometimes sell to sort of other groups working on international governance why they should have any interest in existential risk is that it can give a greater motivation for doing some of those things.
This will be the last question.
Okay, thanks. So you're saying that traditionally the sort of focus in international governance was very state-centric, but now we have other actors like companies which become powerful because companies could move to other countries. That was your claim, right? And I'm somewhat questioning that claim when it comes to sort of technologies like AI. So like, where would sort of Google move? Could it move out of sort of like the US's sphere of influence? Well, perhaps it could when it comes to sort of taxes. They could move to Ireland and like the US is fine with that. But would they really be fine with sort of like if they develop some technology which sort of like threaten the US's military hegemony, influence and power? So, like, could you expand a little bit on that? Is it really the case that we're in this like new era now where companies have more power over the state?
Yes. So I think one thing is that international law states that it's subjects and it can't directly have influence on other actors. So that's kind of one problem, but that's just one thing to be aware of. So what you're talking about more is does a nation state have jurisdiction over a company? And so it does when the company is within its territory, within its legal jurisdiction. Could that company move? I think in some cases it might be more that it can threaten to move, and again, for economic reasons, that can put quite a lot of pressure on the state as to whether it's going to enact laws in certain ways. I've not followed it in detail, but things like the way Apple and the FBI have been going, there seems to be ways that those companies can have quite a strong pushback against regulation. I think there are other examples that aren't maybe that kind of level of company, but about where pharmaceutical trials take place. It's generally thought unethical to go and do it in a developing country where there's different standards, but it's still being done, that you will go and do that. So, yes, I think it may not be that they want to move wholesale, but they may want to set up an arm's length company somewhere else where they can get away with something else.
But, I mean, the examples you're talking about now, this is like, technologies which are not that great significance for the US. Whereas, like, if we're talking about, you know, companies developing, you know, technologies which could change the world order, you know, then they might exert more power on companies than they do with, you know, what Apple and FBI are now involved in.
So again, they might want to. How much they can in the end do, I think. So I do have an opposing view on that. I think, and again, I would take it in the biotechnology area. You don't need to be based in any particular country to get the resources, the knowledge, the technologies, synthesis that you would want to have. And I don't think that if you found something world-changing and you didn't like the regulatory system in one place, you could go somewhere else.
Let's thank her.